Thank you very much. It occurs to me that when it comes to the issue of pederasty or pedophilia, even at the most radical university in California, behavior is very similar to Texas. Several years ago, I presented a paper for a Lambda Classical Caucus panel about the reception of Aristophanes' speech from the symposium. And the original version of that had a short section on the ways in which Aristophanes' speech was used in some NAMBLA and NAMBLA-related literature. And a committee member of mine basically grabbed me by the neck and said, "You are cutting that out before you're tenured." And so it's not an exclusively Texas problem, although I certainly do appreciate that it seems more severe at your institution than it does at ours.
Oh, I would most certainly agree. I mean, many people who consider themselves very liberal and progressive, many people who regard themselves as strong feminists, have real problems when it comes to the issue of anything to do with children. And again, just how do we define child? I mean, that itself is a socially constructed concept, as you know. No, this is by no means a problem limited to state universities in conservative states, like this one. But we do have an even higher burden to deal with here. Now, I mean, it's interesting you bring that organization up because, I mean, as you know, Davidson tried to attack me on the grounds that I had, done some work with them, and it is true, I do know some of those people. I even regard some of them as friends. If I want to research and understand pederasty, what better way of doing that than talking to some pederasts? I mean, I'm not one. It's not what I do. And if I want to understand what motivates people to put themselves at the severe legal risk that they put themselves to in this country in this time by having relationships with teenage boys, the best way to do that is to get acquainted with some people who actually do that and understand what motivates them, what have their relationships been like. And you have to gain the trust of those people. Now, the one thing that I have I've never felt under any pressure by them to mold my views to be equivalent to theirs, which they're in fact not. But if they are going to invoke the example of Greek antiquity, I want to make sure they at least have an accurate historical understanding of what actually took place in Greek antiquity and what the Greek texts themselves said about it. And I've made it very clear that there's really no evidence in ancient Greece that would legitimate pedophilia, properly speaking, by which I mean the love of pre-adolescent children. I mean that they really can't look to the Greeks for any model for that. No, I make no apologies for the facts that I've formed some relationships with those people. And as I said in my response to Davidson in the exchange over the BMCR review, in which he really brought me into the discussion quite gratuitously because I wasn't even the person who had written the bad review of his book in BMCR. I'd be just as happy to work with religious right organizations and teach them the truth about history. Might open some minds. Yeah, Amy?
I'm very interested in this issue. When I teach the history of sexuality in antiquity, I do a section on reception at the end. And students in Los Angeles, I would say they're 100% unshockable, but the level, at which they can be shocked is pretty high. I would say the only thing they really had trouble with during the course of the quarter was Richard Norton's pages on
Now, by homonormativity, you mean androphile normativity.
Well, more like, band of manly brothers fighting shoulder to shoulder kind of thing.
Well, I mean, that is one version of same-sex love, but it is far from the only version. And historically speaking, pederasty, or age discrepant, intergenerational relationships are really attested in a wider range of historical cultures than androphile relationships. And even if we're thinking about, the heroic bands for, the sacred band of Thebes, I mean, if it ever really existed, and I think David Plateau has some pretty good arguments that it didn't. But even there, it was an association between more experienced and senior soldiers and newer recruits who were to be trained and inspired by them. So even if we are talking about a relationship between two partners who are technically adults, there was still a kind of intergenerational aspect to it. Now, intergenerationality is something that, for all kinds of reasons, has a bad taste for a lot of people in our culture. And it's not just with regard to gay-male relationships, even with regard to heterosexual relationships. Look at the way that people would sneer about the relationship between Anna Nicole Smith and that 86-year-old oil billionaire in Houston that she got married to. I mean, that was certainly an intergenerational relationship. Probably more years of distance between her and her husband than between most men and boys in pederastic relationships. And one could very well argue that that was a queer relationship. I mean, Anna Nicole Smith was certainly queer.
Because the money aspect.
We don't have time for more questions. It's 4. Perhaps 4:15. We have one question. Yes.
First of all, I'm interested in the silencing of pederastic discourse in modern America, both on the right and the left, because the left feel that you mentioned that this would give away the game as far as getting into the American. But also, more forward-looking, what can be done to reestablish any kind of discourse about this in America?
Scholars like us have to stand up and talk about it. And now I think we also had a very good discussion of it yesterday at the the uncomfortable panel. And in a way it is, and already what I said there, I view it as almost a moral obligation of those of us who have tenure. Now whether tenure really means anything anymore is remains to be seen. But I feel it's almost a moral obligation to speak for those who have no voice, and to raise issues about even the most reviled members of our society. And certainly pedophiles, in quotation mark, would be among that group. And yes, we have to counter emotion and ignorance and prejudice with reason. And if we're not willing to do that, then why the hell have tenure at all?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for